Anyway, so this morning, I'm starting a new sermon series, which is really your sermon series because we sent out a survey a couple months ago and said, what would you like Pastor Fran to preach on? Which we did a few years ago, but we haven't done it for a long time. So lots of people submitted answers to that. And we only have a few weeks to do this, so I get to pick. So, because I can't do them all. But it's interesting because some of the topics people said they would like me to preach on kind of dovetailed together, where I would look at two suggestions and I would say, these are really come together in one sermon. And in some cases, 2 or 3 people suggested the same topic largely because they are topics that people are struggling with in these times. And they said, hey, would you preach about this? And that's the case with what I'm going to preach about this morning. And the best way I can really introduce this topic this morning is just to quote what one person wrote in their survey. This is what they wrote. I'm trying to unravel the incorrect theology I learned from the Left Behind series and the obsession with hell by the evangelical church rather than love. These have left me with a lot of PTSD. And I've gotten to know this person who gave that entry just a little bit. And it's some of the things in the modern church have affected them so deeply that she and her husband, it's hard for them even to come to church. So I thought, let's just start the series with some light topics. The book of Revelation, hell, Sometimes these suggestions come in and I go, oh, that'll be a good Sunday morning. So my sermon this morning is called Trading Up to a More Beautiful Eschatology. And I know that's a big word. You use words like that and people go, oh, here he goes. But eschatology is a word, it's a Greek word from the Greek of the New Testament. The word is eschaton. And what it refers to is, in theology, it refers to sort of all this end time stuff. But what the word means is it means look down across the history yet to unfold to the end of things, how things will unfold. And really, that's the best way to think about it is, eschatology is our attempt to answer this question. Where is all this going, this whole thing? Where is it going? That's what the theological field of eschatology is sort of about. So when many of us think of the story of modern eschatology, those of us who aren't 30, I know you thought I was 30, I got carded the other day. It was such a blessing, And I said to the young woman, I said, because they have to do it, right? I said, do you really believe that I'm not old enough? And she goes, no. But a lot of us look back to, so I really came to a strong faith as a teenager in the 1970s. And this was the time when everybody was talking about the return of Jesus. And so we were reading books like The Late Great Planet Earth. Some of you might remember things like that. And so in the 70s and 80s, there was just all this, it was just a big thing, everybody talking about this, Jesus coming back, the rapture, wrath of God, whole thing, right? And then kind of later on, I don't know if it was like late 90s, early 2000s, but then the whole Left Behind series came, because there was kind of a lull, and then that kind of revived this whole, what people call kind of this, premillennial kind of rapture and wrath-oriented sort of eschatology, and it became very, very popular again. So those of us, I realize this probably doesn't apply to all of you, but those of us who drank in a lot of that from the people that were preaching to us or the people we watched on TV or listened to on Christian radio, we were taught an eschatology that said Jesus is coming back at any moment. The saved people will get raptured away into the sky. Then there will be terrible times on earth and lots of carnage, and then all the people left pretty much will go to hell. So that's sort of that's a Cliff Notes version, but that's kind of the idea. So sermons are limited, right? I can talk about this morning, but we can't do a 7-part seminar on it. So if you are a person who you really do wrestle with these questions, like some of the people who wrote in, I would suggest 2 resources for you that could be really helpful. One is a sermon series that's still on our website that I preached a number of years ago called The Lamb, the Beast, and the Garden. It's still there. You can listen to it. Some people have said I should preach a series like that again, maybe eventually. And then the other is this book, Reading Revelation Responsibly by Michael Gorman, who is my Facebook friend. Actually, he's a Facebook friend I interact with a fair amount because I've read everything the guy writes. He's a really interesting guy. He is the only Protestant professor at America's oldest Catholic seminary. This guy is so rich and deep in his theology and his biblical exegesis that this Catholic seminary said, would you come and help form the theology of our priests? He's just a unique guy, humble guy. Anyway, that book is readable and really helpful. So almost the beginning thing you need to know about this particular understanding, and I'm not trying to pick on the Left Behind books, but that's kind of how people encapsulate it. You know, two of the people who wrote it kind of called it the Left Behind, theology. And the biggest thing you need to know about this theology is that it didn't exist for the first 1,800 years of the church. I know when I say that, people are like, what do you mean it didn't exist? It didn't exist. Nobody read the book of Revelation that way for the first 1,800 years. It was invented by a sincere English-Irish preacher named John Nelson Darby in the 1830s. And what John Nelson Darby did not know is that the book of Revelation falls squarely into a literary genre called Jewish apocalyptic literature. So, in Jewish apocalyptic literature, there was a whole tradition of this. John was a Jew. He was still in this tradition. In fact, he draws off much of the Jewish apocalyptic literature of the Old Testament. Some of his images in the book of Revelation, which comes at the end of the New Testament, are lifted directly out of like Ezekiel and some of the other prophets. But he didn't understand that this kind of literature is highly symbolic. It's highly metaphorical. If you wanted a comparison, if you're familiar with like Ezekiel's vision of the Valley of Dry Bones in the Old Testament, same kind of thing, right? We don't read Ezekiel's vision and say, so there was this valley with all these bones literally in it. And then they all we go, no, Ezekiel's got this vision and it's telling us a spiritual truth. But John Nelson Darby didn't know this, so what he did was he left behind all that symbolic and metaphorical meaning, and he interpreted the book of Revelation as this roadmap that you could pin to present-day historical events and say, oh, this is telling us about all these things that are happening right now or that are going to happen right before the return of Christ. So as a new Christian in the 1970s, 1980s, I listened to preachers who were telling me things like that the locusts John talks about in Revelation were Russian helicopters, or that the mark of the beast was the birthmark on the forehead of Russian President Mikhail Gorbachev, right? And I could give you 50 other examples of this kind of thing where they said it's this thing that's happening right now, which what always I thought was a little hinky about that, and now I think is a lot hinky about that, is if that's how we're supposed to read the book of Revelation, tying it to all these events happening now or maybe that haven't unfolded yet, that means for the first 2,000 years of the church, since Christ has not returned yet, right? That means for the first 2,000 years of the church, nobody could understand the book of Revelation because they weren't in the events that it was describing. So it would be gibberish to them. And that doesn't make sense because John tells us in the book of Revelation, you need to listen. He tells his first century readers, you need to listen closely to what I'm saying and understand. Well, how could they if it's Russian helicopters? They didn't have helicopters. This kind of theology, and I'm not trying to be overly critical, but sometimes we just have to say what things are, right? Hopefully you guys know my heart is not to be critical of people or what they think. But it fuels all this speculation and all these predictions and then disappointments about the return of Jesus. I've experienced the return of Jesus so many times that I'm used to it. After this many decades on the Christian journey. I'm being funny. But like when someone says to me, like, just like 3 weeks ago, right? Jesus was supposed to come back on a Tuesday. It was all over the internet. And I'm like, And if you remember, I stood up 2 days before that in church, and I said I would still buy groceries for Wednesday dinner. And I was right. I just want to say that I was right. So it kind of fuels all that. And I guess what I want to say is, if we need to be clear that if the first century church fathers, Origen or Augustine, or later on John Duns Scotus or Aquinas, had read John Nelson Darby's writings or the Left Behind books, they would say, what is this? And some would say, oh, that's explaining the book of Revelation. They would have said, no, it's not. They would not have recognized it as a reflection of what they understood the book of Revelation to be, which we'll talk about a little bit. Of course, part of the problem is just these endless predictions and disappointments, but this theology, I think, has also helped to inject a cognitive dissonance into our understanding of the love of God, because kind of what it does is give us two things that we can never quite bring together. Like we all know as Christians, right? God loves us unconditionally, but then kind of what we get told is he loves you unconditionally until he closes the show. And when he closes the show, then there's going to be hell to pay. And so it's kind of like, oh, and if you've been around this kind of theology, what you know is it's like, it kind of says to you, like, Jesus came first time, they're really loving Jesus. And then when he comes back, he's going to be really mad. He's going to have a sword. And the blood's going to run deep in the streets. And you kind of go, oh, so is that the same Jesus, or like how does it work, you know? So I think it puts a cognitive dissonance into our understanding of the love of God. It makes us people who want to believe in the unconditional love of God, but we always have these little things back here that go, well, you know? And that kind of brings us to this whole question of hell, which was mentioned. The person whose submission I read to you mentioned it, and other people in their things mentioned this, that they wrestle with this topic. So I'm going to talk about hell a little bit. I'm not going to resolve it for you, but I'm going to leave you completely unsatisfied. But I know that most of us think our view of hell comes from the Bible. Like whatever we've been taught, we have these images of what hell is, and we say, well, the preacher preached it from the Bible, and he told me that's the deal. But do you know where most of the details in our thinking about hell really come from? They actually come from the medieval Catholic Church, and specifically from a writing called the Inferno, which is the first section of a poem called the Divine Comedy, written in the 1200s by a guy named Dante Alighieri. Dante was the one who really painted these pictures of fiery, eternal torture chambers that have come down to us. So if you've been taught this sort of theology, and I hope this makes sense to you, that has come down to you through the Protestant stream of the church. And the Protestant stream of the church, the Protestant reformers in the 1500s, what they were reacting against was a whole bunch of things in medieval Catholicism. So they rejected a whole bunch of things in medieval Catholicism, particularly ideas about what salvation is and about how you get it. They said you don't earn your way into heaven. It's a gift of grace, Martin Luther and all of that, right? So they rejected many things in medieval Catholicism that probably needed to be rejected, and they embraced different ideas, but they kept the medieval Catholic notions of hell. And they didn't really question like what that would look like or be like, or how many people might go there, any of that kind of thing. What the Protestant reformers did not know anything about, though, was the views of the Eastern Church. So in 1054 AD, you had the church all the way from Western Europe all the way over to the edge of the Muslim territories across Turkey and Eastern Europe and into Turkey and those areas. And so you had this one big church. And in 1054, the entire Christian church, so this is 1,000 years ago, call it roughly, the church split in two because they had a major disagreement. Now today we look back on their disagreement and we're like they disagreed about some things with communion, and they disagreed about what day to celebrate Easter. And they stopped talking to each other, literally, because they excommunicated each other. And the Western Catholic Church kept the Pope, and the Eastern Church had a patriarch, which is sort of the Pope of the Eastern Church, and they just said, we're done with you. So when the Protestant reformers who came from the Western Church tradition, right? Martin Luther was in Germany, that's Western Europe, right? So when the Protestant reformers came out of the Western tradition, they were completely unfamiliar with Eastern Church theology. But in the Eastern Church, there was this strong strain of theology. And keep in mind, the Eastern Church was actually the church that spoke Greek. They were the ones reading the New Testament still in Greek, not the Latin of the Western Church. So the Eastern Church had this strain of theology that went all the way back to the early church that rejected these ideas of eternal torture, and instead believed that, yes, there would be a judgment, because we have to come out of darkness and into light. Yes, there would be a judgment, but ultimately God would restore all things and all people. When I first learned that, I was like, say what? right? Because I'm a Catholic boy who became a Protestant evangelical boy, and then, you hear these things and you go, are you telling me? Yeah, go back and read Origen of Alexandria in the early church. Origen said everybody's going to be restored. And you go, surely you don't mean everybody. And Origen would have said, oh, no, I do. So I have personally come to believe in this teaching. They had a word for it. I guess I didn't tell you that. They had the Eastern Church, the Greek fathers, they had a word for this idea that everything would be restored and everyone would be restored. They called it apokatastasis, which is like the restoration. And I have come to believe in this teaching of apokatastasis. And believe it or not, there's a ton in the New Testament that very heavily lends in this direction. Just as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive. And you go, oh, that's kind of interesting. But so you believe whatever you want to about hell. I mean, that's up to you. I'm not going to tell you what to think about that. But I do want to give you two quick thoughts here to at least temper the view of hell that most of us have been taught. Because as I said, most of it really comes from Dante, not from the New Testament. So here are two thoughts for you. One is, and I don't know if this really fits in my sermon, but I still want to tell it to you. All my adult life in the church, I've been taught this idea that when a person comes to the end of their earthly life and this body breathes its last, all opportunity to come to God is done. Like if you don't make those decisions about faith and about being who you need to be and to however you think about it, if you don't do that before you hit the grave, finito, it's done. So about 10 years ago, I started asking myself, well, I know one verse in the Bible that all the preachers have quoted to me and said, this is where this is taught. But I only know one verse, and I'll tell you that verse in a minute. So I went looking across all the rest of the New Testament, like, where is this idea taught? I couldn't find it. Then I went back to that one verse, which is Hebrews 9:27. What Hebrews 9:27 says is, it is appointed unto man once to die, and after that the judgment. But I'd never really bothered maybe to ask this question about the passage while reading it in context. And in context, all the writer of Hebrews was saying is that just as human beings die one time, so also Christ died one time to redeem us. It's not a technical statement about when the choice to come home to God is or is not available. So then I started to think, so basically nothing in the New Testament says, nothing. I mean, you could challenge me on this. Go home and read you Bible geeks, go home and you do it, man. Let's do it. Let's have a end of life throwdown, So I said, wait a minute. So are you telling me that after people cross over after death, that maybe God is going to encounter them and still seek to reveal himself, to awaken people, to relate to them, to bring them home? And then I started to think, that actually makes a lot of sense to me. Because if I was God, and for whatever reason, people never heard about God or about Christ, or they heard some warped version and they couldn't respond, or they were just too trapped in the darkness that this life sucks us all into, and they never made those movements of heart toward God and toward real life in this life, that when they got to the other side, if I was God, wouldn't I want to be on the other side when they crossed over, to be there to go, hey there, how you doing? You want to hang out? I think I would. If we believe that God loves us as those made in his image infinitely, like would do anything, why would you say, hey, sorry, snooze you lose, baby, you didn't make that choice by the right moment? And so anyway, that's one thing. Like if you've been taught that as I have, I'm just going to tell you, there's nothing in your New Testament teaches it. Go look. Second thing is this. A lot of us have heard the passages quoted probably in sermons where Jesus talks about hell. The word Jesus uses for hell is the word Gehenna, which is a Greek transliteration of the Hebrew word for the Valley of Hinnom, which is a literal valley on the edge of Jerusalem. And so what happened hundreds of years before Jesus in the time of Jeremiah is that Israel was invaded, Jerusalem was conquered, tens of thousands of Jews were slaughtered, and their bodies were burned. Their conquerors burned their bodies in the Valley of Hinnom. So what Jesus is actually saying when you read those passages in context, he's not talking about an eternal torture chamber. He's telling his contemporary Jews in the first century, if you keep pushing on the Roman Empire this way, you're going to end up in the valley of Hinnom, in Gehenna, just like your ancestors did. And you go, oh, I wish somebody would have told me that's what Jesus was talking about. The first time, I think it was the writer Brian Zahnd who first kind of opened that up to me, and I was like, oh, well, that kind of changes what Jesus is talking about. So I'm not saying there aren't other passages. We could talk about other passages in the New Testament that reference the idea of hell. But I'm just saying, like, if you've been taught these are ironclad perspectives, I would question that. I would question that. And I think the truth is that these fears about end times and last things, combined with our Dante-esque view of hell, they've really put a lot of fear on people, kind of this terror about God and his judgment. And I think that's a far cry, actually, from what a lot of the New Testament tells us. Like, I think of John's words in 1 John, when John says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. Those are John's words. What John is telling us is, you don't have to be afraid of God in this way, because there isn't a retributive punishment to fear. And once that's off the table, you go, oh, so we're just loved. We're swimming in this ocean of God's love. I also think that this theology puts a massive pressure on people of faith, because it puts this fire insurance urgency on the whole Christian enterprise. I'm not saying that there isn't a time to be urgent about your spiritual life. There is. And I'm not saying we shouldn't take all these questions about, you guys know me better than that, these questions about God and life seriously. Of course we should. But I think this is where our friend is saying her PTSD comes from. It's kind of like this, like, you might be in danger of being left behind, you better save your friends and family by dinner time, most people are going to hell, and the offer of God's love is only good for so long. I mean, who wouldn't want to be a Christian with terms like that, right? I mean, it puts this huge pressure on people, and what it does is it reduces this whole beautiful gospel that's really about our restoration and transformation as human beings to, you better make some snap decision to get in. Because it's turn or burn, it's if you don't get in. And so then all of a sudden everybody gets in this kind of like frenzy of like, are you, and I'll tell you what, 3 weeks ago or whatever it was when this whole thing about, the rapture and Jesus coming back swept through the church again because some prophet on the internet, on YouTube, said this, and it just, things go viral. It went viral among Christians. So, well, let me pause and say this. If you're listening to prophets on the internet, can I just ask you to do one thing? Stop. You know how much money it costs to start a YouTube channel? $0. So anybody go on there, and if they quote a Bible verse and people go, oh, it must be true. So just stop. Listen to people that you have a reason to believe they have some credibility. So when this whole thing, I'm going to tell you a story. So when this whole thing went down, I ended up on the phone with a young woman who grew up in our church, and who grew up going very conservative Christian schools, who was terrified for herself. Am I a good enough Christian? Terrified for all her friends who weren't sure if they believed in Jesus or not. Some who had been raised Christian said, I don't know what I think about the whole Christian thing at this point. And she was melting down, terrified. That's what this theology produces. That's the pressure I'm talking about. Instead of saying, listen, you are deeply loved by God. And you can take that to the bank. What I really want to do with what's left of this sermon is just make 2 points from the book of Revelation itself. We can't unpack 22 chapters of the book of Revelation in one sermon, unless you want to order lunch and dinner. And probably not even then. But I think by maybe sharing 2 things with you, I can help you give you different lenses, that there are different ways to read these things that nobody just ever really taught us or exposed us to. So let me do that. So first, we've been told that when Jesus returns, he's going to return in this wrathful vengeance. But what if the book of Revelation is actually saying the exact opposite thing about how God wields his power, right? We've been told, like, he came the first time nice, he's coming the second time with a big stick, right? He's coming angry with a big stick. But what if the book of Revelation is actually telling us something that we might call the opposite of that? So in Revelation chapter 5, early on in John's vision, John finds himself in this vision. He's in the throne room of God, and they bring out this scroll. And I never used to understand what the scroll was, but now I get it. The scroll contains, in John's vision, the plan for how everything is going to be restored, how everything and everyone is going to get restored. Like, how is this whole thing going to happen? And John says that that they brought out the scroll, but then they looked around and they said, we can't find anybody who is worthy to open the scroll and unfold its contents. And so John says, well, I'll read it to you. It's in Revelation 5. John says, so I wept and wept, because no one was found worthy to open and read the scroll or to look at it. But one of the elders said to me, do not weep. Behold the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So John is weeping because there's nobody worthy. And worthiness in the first century was all about position and power. So who would be worthy in the first century to open a scroll? Would be like a king, right? So we're looking for like a king, some mighty figure, right? And then the elder even kind of infers that. He says to John, don't weep, don't weep. Turn and look at the Lion of the tribe of Judah, who we understand now to be Jesus, right? So he says, turn and look at the Lion. And then here comes the punchline. John says, and so I turned, and what I saw was laying in the midst of the elders and in the middle of the throne of God was a little lamb that had been slain. Brian Zahn says this is like a first century cartoon that's lampooning the Roman Empire in its dominating power and really lampooning everybody who thinks that the answers are dominating power. You're living in a culture right now and in a world right now where more and more people are thinking that the way we're going to fix everything human beings need fixed is through dominating power. And John is saying the joke is on you. Because the power to unfold the plan of redemption and restoration comes about not by dominating power, not by somebody mighty, but by somebody who is worthy because they have embraced self-sacrificing love. A lamb who was slain in self-sacrificial love. Not power. So what do we do with that when we've been told, well, Jesus is going to come back mad with all this power, and he's going to whoop? You know? And we say, well, wait a minute, but the whole book opens saying, no, the answer is not that. Well, I'll tell you how we've misread the later part of the book. When you get to Revelation 19, we see this image of Jesus riding on a white horse, and his name is Faithful and True, and he's got a sword. And if you look up all the Christian paintings that depict this scene in Revelation 19, Jesus on a white horse, sometimes he's got armor on, and he's got this sword in his hand, and he is ready to do it. But it's a misread. Because what John says is, he was on a white horse, and he had a sword, but it wasn't in his hand. It was coming out of his mouth. Because the sword is the word that he speaks of truth and justice and love. It's not a sword with which you kill people. It's a sword that sharply brings the truth of justice and love to all people. And then people always go, yeah, but what about all that blood? It says his robe was dipped in blood. And they want to imagine this is the blood of all the people Jesus killed, and the blood is running deep in the streets. If you read the passage closely, guess what you see? It's his own blood. It's the same as the little lamb slain. It's his self-sacrificial love. He overcomes evil by love, which most of the time we don't believe will really work, but that is the promise of the gospel, that love and goodness will triumph. So that's one thing, is like the book of Revelation is not giving us this idea of that God is going to solve everything by dominating power. Exactly the opposite. This is why Christ dies on the cross. This is why Jesus washes the disciples' feet when they are in the middle of arguing about who is the greatest, because dominating power is never going to be the solution. So that's one thing. Then at the end of the book of Revelation, here's just another little snapshot for you. So we're running a little long. That's bad on the first day of 2 services. So I'll try to give this a little snapshot quick. So you get to the end of the book of Revelation, chapters 21, chapter 22, and John tells us about the city of God, the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. It's a metaphor. It's a picture of where God's going to dwell with his people. And then the other picture we get is that outside the city, there's this lake of fire, right? And we know that's bad. We've heard sermons about the lake of fire. And if you end up at the lake of fire, it's a done deal, right? And so that's the thing, right? But then John tells us that inside the city, the Spirit of God and the people of God, whom he calls the bride, they're yelling something. And what they're yelling is this: hey, if anybody's thirsty, is anybody out there thirsty? If anybody's thirsty, let him come and drink freely of the water of life. Well, who are they yelling to? I imagine the thirsty people would be the people on the beach out at the lake of fire. In John's symbolism, that's the thing. These people are hot and parched. They have not yet come out of the darkness into the light. They have not yet come out of hatred into love. They have not yet come out of fear into the security of goodness and love. And so the Spirit and the people of God are saying, hey, are you ready yet? And then John tells us this about the city. He says, and her gates will never be shut. What do you mean they'll never be shut? I thought that was the whole idea. So all the good people came in, all the bad people were out there. We shut the gates, and that's eternity. John says, no, her gates are never going to be shut. And so that makes me think, like, how long does God have to wait for people? Because what I'm not saying here is God's just going to say, like, whatever, just come on in. John actually tells us nobody comes in the city without washing their robes. You got to be willing to come out of the darkness into the light. You got to be willing to come out of the hatred into the love. You got to be willing to come into goodness. You have to bow your life before it. But how long does God have to wait for people to do that? Maybe forever. Maybe forever. I think that this theology has swept through popular Christian culture, and it's given people a lot of terror, and I think it's kept a lot of people from resting in the expansive ocean of God's love. So I want to just do two things here at the end. First, I want to grade this modern eschatology, like when your teacher puts a grade on your paper, right? Because once a grade's written on the paper, you go, could be good, could be bad, right? So I'm giving this theology an F in both the categories of historical theology, because it didn't exist for 1,800 years, and also an F for solid biblical interpretation, because I don't think it's a good way to read the Bible. And second, let's just end by letting the Apostle Paul tell us about the love of God. In Romans 8, he says, so who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or distress or persecution or famine, nakedness, peril or sword? Then he quotes this Old Testament passage, how we're like sheep for the slaughter. He's basically saying life beats us up really bad. And then he says, despite the fact that life beats us up really bad, yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who has loved us. For I am persuaded that neither death nor life, that's interesting, death nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor anything above or anything below, nor anything in the whole created order shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus, our Lord. So, brothers and sisters, let us rest in the expansive ocean of God's love. Let us find great joy in the ocean of this secure love, this love that has been extended to us by a God who has said to us, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you, and who has said to us, behold, I am making all things new. Amen.